is to avoid feeling that weakness, that lack of power. So that's a really good example of how we can shift from looking at the qualities we want to embody, the holes that we have, the barriers we have to preventing us from embodying them, and then taking a look at the subconscious. And there's a lot of ways to look at the subconscious. Asking questions of ourselves is extremely important. We just need to know where to look.
Yeah, wonderful, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. One of the ways in which I work with people's subconscious is through the body, through embodiment. Therefore, by having people externalize those associations, those stories, those beliefs through the physicality, and then meeting that resistance through their physicality, there's a release that often happens, especially when there's an amplified field in a small group scenario. So I really resonate with what you're saying. Are you happy to answer a question or two, by the way?
Of course.
Wonderful. Well, we have a question here from Maria, and she asks, and I think this is a fascinating question, so I'm excited to ask it. She says, do you believe it's possible and probable that we may carry baggage attached to us from our lineage or from our ancestry? In other words, not just from our childhood, from 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, but what about that which comes maybe from before us? I relate to this often because I look at my lineage from my dad, my father's dad, my granddad and his granddad and his granddad. There's some real strong patterns emerging that seem to be beyond this time. What are your thoughts about that? And what would you do to look at clearing that?
It definitely seems possible. I haven't done a lot of research in that area, so I can't answer candidly. Or I can't answer, authoritatively, I should say. Candidly is what I am answering. I don't know. That's actually one of the biggest things to real development, is being willing to acknowledge we don't know something and to ask the question. So I would suggest, actually, to look into that, to explore what are the qualities in our parents and our grandparents that we personally experienced, and how do we think that our parents or grandparents got them? Did they get them from their parents and grandparents? Most likely. So if we look back, I think we're going to see much stronger correlation to our present lifetime experience as affected by our parents, as affected by their grandparents, than we will in the actual DNA, biology, genealogy. Now that said, there is some evidence to suggest that we also carry some certain types of predispositions and who knows what else might be in there in the unconscious, the subconscious. You asked earlier, how do I define subconscious? For me, it's anything I'm not conscious of. That can be outside of me, that can be inside of me, it could be past, present, future, it could be my body. As you know from your work, the body carries so much unconscious tension. I'm still working through it. I mean, I find myself, many times a day hunching my shoulders like this, holding them up. Even when I do something like drink a glass of water, I often do this little hunch here. And I've been exploring that, and I'm realizing that I carry an identity that says I have to hold up the world. I have to hold it up. If I don't do things, things won't get done. And so it's so unconscious that every time I find myself hunching my shoulders, I kind of let them relax a bit and just let them rest. Let myself integrate that awareness of, I feel right now I have to hold something up. Now, most likely, I'm pretty sure I got that from my father, because I was raised to be successful. I was raised to be the pillar of strength in the family. I was raised to be the quote-unquote man of the house. Whenever my father would go away for a trip, he'd say, hold down the fort while I'm gone. You're the head of the house now, things like that. It didn't matter that I was 7. And I know he wasn't fully serious, but underneath it was him basically giving me his beliefs. And I would bet, and I haven't had this conversation with him, but I really do look forward to it and plan to have it with him, is what messages did he get from his father? What messages did his father get from, grandfather and so on? I really think there's going to be a much stronger correlation in the actual life experience we have now that we got from our parents, who then had it in their life experience from their parents, than we're going to find within the actual genealogy and biology and DNA.
Wow, fantastic.
But it's still possible, and I'm not going to discount that, and that's a question I'm going to hold and explore. So thank you, Maria.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. So let's look at the next question. This is from Kathy. And Kathy vulnerably shares, she says, I've been on antidepressants for over 10 years. 6 months ago, I took myself off them all at once. I've been told my body has to remember how to create making them again. I've been on such a roller coaster of emotions, and I'm having such a struggle and challenge in holding any form of positive emotion. And I know that's not me. Any suggestions?
Yeah, well, for those listening, first I would generally advise not to drop all the antidepressants at once. Usually a progressive approach is more advisable because there are real physiological, biological withdrawal symptoms and ways that our body is adapted to having those drugs inside us. That said, I agree. I don't believe that is her true nature. I think that right now, the real challenge she is experiencing is that for so long there was identification with the holes, the deficiencies, the weakness, anxiety, probably fear. And now she has to face those things, to really look deep in and say, what is it that I'm really scared of, and where did these fears come from? It's very important right now to get some real social support. So I would recommend finding a teacher, a therapist, a spiritual life coach, ideally a meditation group, even a spiritual school that she can work within that has some understanding of these kinds of concepts that we're talking about, of how to look at deficiencies and work through them. Because that's really what's happening here, is the realization that, okay, she knows this isn't who she is. That's really important, because that means somewhere inside she does know who she is. And now her work is to remember that, to connect with that, to deepen that. And as she continues to do that, her biology will rewire itself chemically to rebalance itself, because that's the stories in her past, as we talked about, are what caused this disbalance. And at some point it became so overwhelming that drugs were necessary because the stories were no longer adequate to cope with the world she was in.
Now, Chris, do you believe in the fact that, do you think the neurology is ever hardwired, where it can never be rewired? Or are we just adding layers of filters to some disturbed programming? In other words, if we're, there are some schools of thought that say by the age of 3, your basic neurology is hardwired and hard set. After that, you can make adjustments. Of course, you can change, but if you're not conscious, if you're not present, you're always going to default back to that set program. That you can't really change the core of that programming because that neurology is not plastic anymore. But you still have the ability to learn new programs that can go on top. What are your thoughts about that? That nobody asked that question. That was a question from me.
That doesn't really connect with me personally. And I think that's because I've experienced the changing of my thought processes, the changing of my patterns. The way I experience the world fundamentally changes through doing this kind of work. And so because of that, but it didn't change until I was threatened with divorce. So it took a real catalyst. And even then, the catalyst only started the process of, like you say, adding some programs on top and things like that. But as far as this sort of default goes, I think what happens, in my experience, and the inner critic is a good way to look at this. The inner critic happens early on in life, usually sometime between about 4 and 7 years old is when we really start to develop it. So it is pretty early, maybe not 3 years old, but very early in life. And it develops. And I don't think that the inner critic goes away. It's not like we can just suddenly do so much work that the inner critic is gone. Really what happens is we learn not to listen to it. We learn not to pay attention to it. We learn to function from a different place. So I guess it's sort of, to tie into what you're saying, what I'm saying sounds like, yeah, okay, it is there. It doesn't change. But I wouldn't say we put things on top of it, of this 3-year-old instinct, of this 3-year-old hardwiring. What I would say is we learn how to operate from a different aspect of our being, such that we no longer identify with that, or at least not as frequently.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. So now, next question comes from a lady called Monica, and she says, I'm curious about how Chris responds to your take that we don't have to go back and find out what happened in our past in order to heal. So she's referring to the fact that she's heard me speak in the past about how we don't have to psychoanalyze every single detail in our life. We don't have to figure out who did what to us, how and when, in order to shift, in order to embrace a new shift and change in our lives. So she's asking, what's your take on that? Do you agree, or do you have a different slant? Do you think it is important? Can that be left out? What's your thoughts about that?
My experience is that it can't be left out. And what I love is in A Course in Miracles, how it says there are many paths to the truth, and A Course in Miracles is just one. So your experience tells you it does work, and the people who work with you, who work through your methodology, discover that it works. So I would say that rather than looking at an either or, it's really about us finding paths and teachers and work that connects with us, that really works for us. So I would say try it out, whatever it is you want to try. Try it for a month, try it for 6 months, try, Christian's approach for 6 months, try my approach for 6 months, try another approach for 6 months, and see what you learn about yourself. Because you may discover that for you, a specific path works really well, and another one doesn't. And the opposite may be true for someone else, but if we don't stick with something for at least some amount of time, we won't develop that awareness. We'll just fall into the same old trap of start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, without really finding out what works for us, or in this case for Monica. So I think all of it, and the and approach is much more suited for at least the way I engage with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating study. There's a lot of these psychometric personality profile tests out there, and there's things, human design, and then there's this whole bunch of ways to figure out, who you are, what you're aligned with, what your design is, etc., etc. And what I've noticed is that we're the same and we are different. In the sense, like you just said, some things work better for other people. I know, for example, from the perspective of human design, I'm an emotionally defined, what they call projector. That is, I don't generate my own energy. I guide and amplify those around me. It resonates from a perspective of what my experience is. And I've noticed that people who are more mind-defined, thought-defined, would find it very, very difficult to go through an emotional journey to awakening if they predominantly kind of see the world through an intellectual or an academic or a mental or thought-based framework. So I really resonate with what you just said. That is, it's not either or, it's and both. And it really is about, are we open to exploring and being open to, having this conversation rather than getting righteous about it and thinking, well, no, my way is better than your way.
Nice inner critic interjection there, yeah. You really touched upon something I think is important, and we haven't discussed, which is, at least not much, which aspect of ourselves are we identifying with? Are we identifying with our mind, our body, our spirit, our emotions? And where I'm going with this is, on the spiritual path, the path of living consciously, the path of living as the true authority of our lives. To do that, we can no longer solely identify with the mind. We have to identify with an